tasks.
Oh yes, I do that too. So here it is, focus. All right, so today we're gonna do blood vessels and lymph, but because of our time, we'll most likely probably just do blood vessels. So here we go. Let's dive into the blood vessels. The first thing we're gonna talk about when it comes to blood vessels is simply what their functions are. Like they're generally hollow tubes that form the pulmonary and systemic circulatory loops, and it's kind of very related to everything that we have been talking about um right today.
Mhm.
Earlier, the three basic blood vessels that we have in our body is your arteries, that is going to carry blood away, right? We know that that's going to go into the systemic circuits. Your capillaries are going to be allowing the exchange, meaning from deoxygenated to oxygenated blood. And physiology, from a physiological level, that just means that your deoxygenated has more CO2 on it, and then your oxygenated, are essentially what's happening is that there's a gas exchange where CO2 are being released and O2 is being exchanged for that. And then that means that you have enough oxygen to supply to your tissues that needs it, right? Your veins are going to carry blood towards the heart, right? Because once it supplies the oxygenated blood or the oxygen rich blood, right, it's going to enter the capillaries, and we'll talk a lot all about that. And you'll essentially go to the capillaries, and then you'll have the deoxygenated blood that's going to then come back around to the venous system, right, to the heart. Right, so here we go. So the thing about that he wants you to know in terms of the blood vessels, specifically the histology of these blood vessels and the different types of blood vessels that are involved in your system, are going to be your arteries, your veins, and your capillaries, right? And those are specifically what he talks about when he say, what about the systemic arterioles? What about the systemic artery? We're going to talk about that today, right? So your blood vessel histology, first you have to know the lumen, right? The lumen is just the circular space in the center here. And then your arteries or your vessels are going to have these different layers, right? And those layers are going to start with your tunica intima, and the tunica intima is just that first tiny simple layer of cells that's going to be surrounding that vessel, right? And it's going to be like your simple squamous epithelium, if you ever ask about that, right? And then the very next layer, right after your tunica media tunica intima, is your tunica media, right? And your tunica media becomes very important. I think last week we talked, sometime last week we talked about the importance of what part of our vessels help with the regulation of blood, right? How does our blood know to go towards or to supply the blood so that our tissues receive the oxygenated rich blood, and or how do they know to constrict or or like kind of lower the secretion of blood, right? How does our body know to do that, right? And this layer, tunica media, is the important part of that, because it has the circular smooth muscles that's going to respond to some neurotransmitters, right? Specifically acetylcholine. Like those are the one that is going to help figure out whether the tunica media is going to constrict. Constricting means it lowers the amount of blood that goes into that, right, to that vessel. And then vasodilate means they increase the amount of blood that's going into a vessel, right? So that tunica media really becomes important in terms of regulation, right? Regulation, like I said, just means that it's either going down in the amount of blood in that vessel by constricting, by closing up those diameters of the vessels, or by opening,
Mhm.
right, by vasodilation. And those are going to be triggered by neurotransmitters like we talked about. Acetylcholine is one of those very important ones. Contraction of the muscle, specifically the circular muscle tissue or smooth muscle tissue. Your tunica externa is that outmost outer layer, and the most important job of that is just to give it support and attaches the vessel to the surrounding tissue. And why, right? Why do we need that? We need that because the very next, right, your tunica media is what? Going through a lot of regulatory function, right? And if pressure is going up, you need something to support that vessel so that it doesn't rupture, right?
And this is found in all arteries and capillaries and all that, or just what specifically?
So we'll talk about, there's different types of arteries. We have elastic arteries, we have muscular arteries, we have arterioles. Some of these layers exist in some of those and some of them don't. So we'll also talk about like what those are specifically. Okay. All right, so this is just kind of more like a picture of all of it, right? I said important to know in a tunica media is your endothelium, right? Endothelium right there. And then in your tunica media, you have your smooth muscle, right? Right. Then, yes, your tunica externa, which is also tunica adventitia. All right, this is the structural difference of arteries and veins. They love to test this. They love to ask this question, right? Obviously, like we said, just know this slide. Veins are larger in the diameter. They're larger in their lumens. Why, right? And we learned about that right now. Okay, so this is like the main function of your artery, right? And this is kind of just repeating over and over again, right? Away from the heart. It's going to carry blood away from the heart. But they do not always carry oxygenated blood, right? We know that, right? They're going to, pulmonary arteries are going to carry what? Deoxygenated blood, right? Because that's going towards where? The pulmonary circuit, right? Right, okay. And then these arteries, their main function is to maintain pressure, right? Right, because our veins are not going to be, as, I didn't put them in like one slide to compare them for you, which I should have, but your veins, they're not going to have
As much force.
Hmm?
They're not going to have as much force compared to the arteries. Is that what you were going to say?
As much, in a way, yes, but they're also not going to have like the ability to be able to handle that type of force, right?
Oh, okay.
Right. And I didn't put it on here, but I really should have. So let me just drag this picture here so you know what I'm talking about. So you can see, can you see this?
Yeah, I can see it.
So here you can see this is your artery, right? And then your vein, right? And you can see that your veins are much thinner, right? And why is that? Because that middle area, the tunica media, is not as, thick, right? And that's more so because it just doesn't have as much smooth muscle in it. Veins are, arteries, remember I said that they're kind of very involved in that regulatory in terms of constricting, vasodilating and things like that. Veins are not really doing that. So they're not going to have those functions. And that's what makes them
different. Okay.
Does that make sense? So that's,
yeah, that makes sense.
And I wish I would, I'll just make sure to add this picture on here, so that you have that in terms
They
of,
just don't function the same. They don't have the capability, like you said, because they
yeah, they're thinner.
they don't have an extra. They have a thinner. They have the same component but much thinner, which limits their capability. Okay.
Yeah, that, and because the the layers of the tunica media is much thinner than it would be for compared to the arteries. I think that's really what they like for you to know, that the tunica media middle layer in the veins is thinner than the tunica externa usually, and much thinner compared to the tunica media of the artery. Right? They don't have those, which then makes them less capable to handle pressure than a usual artery would. Okay. Okay, so now these are the different types of arteries that most likely he's, going to test you on. He's gonna ask you about what elastic arteries are, what muscular arteries are, and what arterioles are, and kind of like what makes them stand out, what makes them different.
Mhm.
Right? Okay. And usually the elastic artery is like going to be your largest one, right? They're usually close to the heart. And sometimes he might even ask you to like, what types of arteries will have elastic type of arteries, right? And elastic just means that they're able to kind of like, recoil once you kind of expand them, right? It's kind of like the ability like the lungs have. When you inhale, will it come back? Or when your heart pumps, will it recoil, right? Once you increase the pressure, what type of artery structures are going to be involved in that having the ability to recoil and snap back in its place, right? And that's your elastic artery. So these like kind of elastic arteries, they deal with high pressures, and arteries that usually have big lumens, right? And that, they're gonna have this elastic fiber in the intima media and the externa. And like I said, they're gonna be involved in making sure of that back, the elastic recoil, that's going to help with the regulation, with the constriction and the vasodilation of the blood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh my God.
You okay?
Yeah, sorry. I'm in a meeting right now. Talk to you later. Sheesh. Okay.
Okay.
My FaceTime is connected to my laptop. So yeah, sorry about that. Okay.
It's fine. I get it. Trust me. Okay, so now you have your muscular arteries, right? And your muscular arteries, these are essentially like, medium-sized arteries. And what's the thing here is that these are these are gonna be like these arteries usually branches into your smaller arteries in your arterioles.
Hmm.
And their walls contain like large numbers of smooth muscles, and helping them in terms of like in terms of contraction, but essentially like the largest, well, they're not the largest, they're essentially um, the media and the tunica media and adventitia of the muscular artery are approximately like equal in thickness, right? As I see it, let me show you here.
Hmm.
So you can see from the elastic artery, this tunica media, it's like huge, right?
Hmm.
And that's because of that recoil. Like they need to be able to participate in that. But this tunica externa is just for support, right? And then you see here the the muscular artery, that tunica media is not as huge, right? It's almost kind of the same as the tunica externa, right?
Hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. So they don't get in as much recoil, if any.
Yeah, it's essentially like they still have that function of recoil because that's important for arteries, but the elastic ones, that they're really the ones that are make, they're, I would say their ability and their impact in regulating the blood for elastic arteries are greater than muscular arteries, though muscular arteries still has that function. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. All right, so that's that. And then we have our wonderful and beautiful arterioles. And like I said earlier, these are the ones that usually branches off the muscular arteries, right? Um, and in a way, they like to call them like the largest, and that's just because when arteries or anything that is small come together, right, the surface area becomes larger, right? So when they're saying there is most abundant type or largest, it's just because all those tiny things coming together makes it big.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. So basically, these are going to be like your major contributor to like systemic blood pressure and blood distribution. Um, and they're going to be mainly involved in that vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Um, so they're going to have the smallest diameter. That's how you're going to be able to identify them, right? And if you look here, you're going to see their tunica media is externa is thinner, and their media are kind of like only 2 layers thick, right? So it's important to kind of be able to um, kind of see the differences between these types of arteries, just because those are usually like a point of question or testing points that they like to say or they like to ask you. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is, oops. I put this picture on here to like kind of reiterate it even more, right? So,
Mhm.
so one thing you have to know is that adventitia and in tunica externa are the same thing, okay? Don't forget that, right? Because sometimes they'll like to use that to confuse you.
Okay, so they're used interchangeably. Okay.
Right. Like I said, the tunica intima, as if you look here, know that those are, know how to kind of look at them, right? If you see something that has this tunica media that is larger than all the other different types of arteries, right? Know that that has to be your elastic artery, right? And this tunica media, also know and understand like those smooth muscle tissues that are kind of responding to vasoconstriction and vasodilation are really important. And they are the largest in elastic arteries because of their ability to be able to do recoil, right? Still exist in muscular arteries, and these arterioles are going to branch off of these arterial arteries and muscular arteries. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so just um know that that is the case. And then you're probably sitting here and you're just like, but what about the difference between arteries and arterioles? Like, what is that about, so your arteries, like we said, those are the blood vessels that are going to essentially deliver that oxygen rich from the heart to the tissues, right? But your
Mhm.
arterioles, they're like the smaller arteries, right? And they carry blood to the capillary beds, right? Does that make sense? Like,
Mhm.
your arteries are going to deliver oxygen rich blood from the heart to your tissues. Now your arterioles are going to deliver that blood into the capillary beds. And those are important distinctions, right? Because your arteries, they're going to extend from the aorta and lead to the arterioles, right? And your arterioles extend from the arteries and lead to the capillaries, right? And this is, I think, what your teacher what's essentially
Mhm.
saying. Like you have all these arteries, like you have the abdominal arteries, right? That's going to branch into your celiac trunk, your SMA, your IMA, and then they're going to have these little tiny mesenteries. And these mesenteric arteries that's essentially going to supply blood to the rest of the intestines that are going to be considered those arterioles that's going to lead to the capillaries, right?
Mhm.
And those, and then, just know, because that is the case, your arterioles are going to have what? Smaller diameter, right?
Mhm. Right. Right.
Okay. Um, right. Okay. So just wanted to bring that home. Hopefully that makes sense.
Mhm.
So now let's talk about your capillaries, the one that is kind of giving you the headache this week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about capillaries. So like I said, capillaries and arterioles essentially kind of like works together, right? And what they do is they're like tiny blood vessels and they have thin walls. And what they do is they have oxygen and nutrients from the blood that can move through walls and get into organs and tissues, right? When I think
Mhm.
of capillaries, I really think about like superhero abilities, because they're the arteries that can really, like, they're the capillaries or the type of blood vessels that can move through walls. Right. And so capillaries are where oxygen and nutrients are exchanged for carbon dioxide and waste. Right. So this is where, like, once you get that oxygen rich blood from arteries, and then it branches to those arterioles, and the arterioles pass it off to the capillaries, then in that capillary, those oxygen rich blood are going to start dropping and becoming oxygen poor, right? So what's happening now is that capillary is going to take all those oxygen and all those nutrients, and they're going to exchange it for carbon dioxide and waste. And that's when now the blood becomes deoxygenated blood that is then going to come back around to the right side of the heart. Does this make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. So answer me. Let me ask you a question. What are the function of capillary arteries?
You said it's for to move oxygen and nutrient exchange, right?
Okay. Exchange, yes. Nutrient waste between blood, yes. Okay. So your the way that it does this, you're probably wondering, is like, how in the world is this moving through blood thing happen, right? What
Mhm.
happens? What are the processes that helps this situation happen? And the thing about it is, like, we're talking about it here, but when we start talking about like the renal system in, like, I think a week or so, right? We start talking about more systems. You're gonna start to see that, like, some of these terms here are applicable to other systems. Not only is the capillaries going to exist in this form and in their function here, but these capillaries exist in your kidneys, right? And your kidneys are going to be involved in those movement of fluids, so you can pee out waste, right? That your body,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, okay. So when you say fluid exchange, okay,
Exactly. But like they have
they're specific.
specific like terminology.
Urea. Mhm.
They want you to talk about this stuff. They have what they call capillary filtration, right? And capillary filtration just means that that fluid, that movement of fluid, is going from the blood into the interstitial fluid, into essentially like the from the blood out to this, out of the interstitial fluid, is just kind of out of the plasma, out of the blood vessel, right? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Let me show you this, because this can be confusing sometimes. um let's just let me show you this in picture, because this is what gets people CF. Okay, let's see if this is a good picture. Let me just show you this. Okay, does this picture help at all? Let's see.
Oh, okay.
Right. Okay. So what's happening here is you have, for example, like I said, right, this fluid is going to move from the blood plasma into the interstitial fluid, right? And if you look at what this is trying to show you is that obviously this is the plasma, right? Right, where that, let's just say capillary filtration is happening, right? And that fluid is going to move from the plasma into the interstitial fluid, right?
Mhm.
It is because this is like, this is what students like get, many students get so confused over this stuff. But like I said, that is going to move just through the interstitial fluid. The fluid in between cells, the fluid in between cells are your interstitial fluid, right? And now
Mhm.
fluid inside of the cell is your intracellular fluid, right? When we
Mhm.
talk about ECF and we talk about ICF, that is between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. And the outside of the cell is going to have your plasma, right?
Mhm.
And in that plasma, once that fluid moves out, that is your interstitial fluid, right?
Mhm.
You have solutes outside of this here in between, right? When you have solutes and water goes into the ECF, right? That's what
Mhm.
we're talking about with like osmotic regulation and stuff like that. Remember when you put like, if there's plasma protein inside of here, right? That means that the fluid is going to get attracted into the ECF, right? Now, right? But if it was in the ICF, which is the intracellular fluid, then the water is going to go towards here. It's going to follow where there's a lot more. When it's going to be, the water is going to follow where it is crowded, right? So all I'm saying here is that capillary filtration is going to go from plasma into the interstitial fluid, and all of those things are going to be regulated depending on whether there's a lot more solutes, right? If you give someone saline, right? If you give someone just like, a higher concentration of NaCl in their blood, right? That's going to what? Attract more water to come out of the cell, right? But you have to be
Mhm.
careful with that, right? Because you learn this, like cells can shrink if it's too much,
Mhm.
right? So this, I think this is why some parts of this, like the fact that your teacher is a physiologist and teaching anatomy, these are the kind of things that he might emphasize. And then also at the same time, we talked about the filtration, right? But now the reabsorption of the fluid is going to go the opposite way, right? Now it's going to go from the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma. Does that make sense? Right. So just
Yeah.
remember that that is the main function of the capillaries. And that's why it's so important, because our arteries are not doing any of that. How do we regulate electrolytes in our body? Your capillaries. How do we
Oh, so this is kind of like when people's like varicose veins swell up or something like that, right? This is kind of involved with this.
differently, because your varicose veins are your veins, but your arterioles and your capillaries are more so involved in this,
Mhm.
right?
Okay.
Okay. And then maybe this might help show this too, because this is something that um this is exactly like what's happening, right? Remember, I think, just kind of bringing this home for you in terms of like the information. Like, remember, I think last week we were talking about like sodium follow water. Like, this is all of that relationship right here. This filtration and reabsorption thing that the capillary does, those movement of sodium and water is because of the capillary. capillaries. Those capillaries are involved in filtration and reabsorption. And depending on what system or what part of the body you are, they have those, they call it something else so different. Like in the kidney, they call it the glomerulus, right? And the glomerulus is going to have the nephrons, right? And that's what they call that. And then in the pulmonary system, they call it the pulmonary circuit or the pulmonary capillaries, right? So
Mhm.
that's all I'm saying. Sorry, I kind of went in a ramble there. Okay, so now you have what we call the capillary beds. And essentially, the capillary beds are just like, it's is that it is,
Yeah, it's just a network of them.
right. So what happens is that you have these arterioles and then capillaries. These are the like kind of that center of the capillaries becomes that capillary bed. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. Or
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Even the picture explains it well.
so the capillary beds are like just the network of like blood vessels that allow the transport of nutrients, right, and the oxygen in the body. So like this, the capillaries sure might be the individual kind of capillary, right, but the connection and the network of blood cells becomes the capillary bed, right?
Mhm.
um okay. And so that capillary bed, so once you have the arterioles, the capillary beds, and then in the middle, at some point, like those blood that's getting exchanged is going to reach the part where it's going to be your capillary venules, right? So it's going to, now the blood is going to kind of flows into the capillary bed from the arterioles, but then it's going to start moving to the venule part of the capillaries, right? So it's blood's going to start flowing from the capillaries through the venules, right? And those are going to happen through what? The vasoconstriction and the vasodilation, right? To regulate the blood flow in the whole capillary bed, right? Because like if they don't have those vasoconstriction and the vasodilation thing, what do you think is going to happen? Your blood vessels just going to stay put, right? These
Mhm.
dilation thing, these are what tells them go, like go forward. Like that's why those little pressures going, it's kind of like pumping something, like it's kind of like a host of like of that's getting that has like water going through it. Like if unless there's like these vasoconstriction and vasodilation of these arterioles, they're not going to be able to know how to move,
Mhm.
right? And those are going to be kind of sensed and regulated by the help of vasoconstriction and vasodilation via those smooth muscles that are going to be stimulated by neurotransmitters like your acetylcholine, right? So now you have now there's also different types of capillaries. You're probably like, um
More,
huh?
like more.
Yeah, so not only our capillary is so important, there are also different types of them depending on what part of the body we're kind of dealing with. So there's, like I said, there's different structural types, right? And there's continuous capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, and then what we call the blood sinusoid capillaries. And then so we'll start off with talking about like what is a continuous capillary, and continuous capillary is the most common type. Yeah, you have to remember this one. They have like small gaps between each endothelial cells that allows like gases and water and sugar and some hormones to pass through. So the continuous capillary, for example, is in the brain. I mean, not in the brain. The brain is the exception, right? So these capillaries are part of like the the blood-brain barrier. Yeah, which helps to protect the brain by allowing the most essential nutrients to cross, right? So that's why continuous capillaries in this area don't have any gaps between endothelial cells, and their surrounding basement membrane is also thicker, right? So
So everywhere else it has small gaps in the endothelial cells except in the brain barrier.
yeah, except in the blood-brain barrier.
Okay.
So remember that, okay?
Make the exception there. Okay.
We
That
have like
works.
5 more slides. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so just remember that it's most common and it's found in the brain. And then you have your fenestrated capillaries, and fenestrated capillaries, just think of them like leakers. They are leakers. Then, then continuous capillary, which is like the opposite, right? These one, they contain like small pores in addition to like small gaps between cells in their walls, and that allows for like the exchange of larger molecules, right? So this type of capillary is found in areas that require a lot of gas exchange, like your blood and your tissues. Like for example, your kidneys, your small intestines, where nutrients are kind of absorbed from food. The kidneys, where where waste products are filtered out of the blood. So just know that your fenestrated are your leakers and your continuous are complete opposite, which is only basically found in the blood-brain barrier. Make sense?
Uh-huh.
And then you have this blood sinusoid, which is interchangeable with sinusoidal capillaries, right? So these are like your rarest, they are rare and the leakiest type of capillary. Sinusoid capillaries allow for gas exchange of large molecules, even cells, like cells can get through them. They're able to do this because they have like many large gaps in their capillary wall, in addition to pores and like small gaps. So the surrounding basement membrane has like these incomplete openings in many places. So this type of capillaries you find in your liver and your spleen and your bone marrow. This is kind of like where these capillaries allow newly produced blood cells to enter in the bloodstream and begin circulation, right? So this is really, really important, right? For example, like capillaries are important for regulating septic shock in your immune system. They respond to bacterial toxin by releasing cytokines and inflammatory stuff, right? And the way that they do that in this reaction is that they ultimately lead to like this vasodilation, like increasing the diameter of the blood vessel. And then they're also going to increase like the capillary permeability, and that just means that they're going to like increase the space in between cells, and they're going to make that specific blood vessel more leaky, right? Allowing large proteins and fluids into the tissue interstitium, right? And in that case, that's why like some people become kind of apparent or seems like they're hypovolemic when they're really not, and that's just because the fluid are being redistributed somewhere else because their capillaries are opening up, right? And so patients, because of that, because the blood vessels and capillaries are opening up and they're letting all those fluid out, patients sometimes can have hypotension from that, right? Because it's not staying inside of the plasma or the blood vessel, right? So they have to give them like fluid resuscitation because of that profound decrease in peripheral vascular resistance and in that fluid that's inside, because those capillaries are becoming leaky. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, I hope that brings it home for you in terms of why these capillaries are important. Okay, and I think, these are just kind of like more information about like the veins specifically. We talked about the arteries earlier, but the veins are, they're going to be the ones that are going to carry blood from capillaries back to the heart, right? This is like where the connection kind of, ended, or when we were talking about it earlier today, right? Because we kind of just, most people in anatomy class, they just talk about like, the blood going from the, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, the big, then, the different parts of the heart to the left side to the aorta and stuff like that, then comes back to the vein and do it all over again. But then there's really like this whole thing where we don't really talk about like those different branches that happens, right? From the artery to the arterials, from the capillary to the venules, to then the larger veins that are then essentially the capillaries are going to have those deoxygenated form of blood that's then going to be in the veins back to the heart, right? Does this make more sense now from what we
It's because everything's being connected back into this circulation.
right? So again, the veins primary job is to move blood,
Blood
right?
from the capillaries back to the heart.
And these are low pressure, right? And it's low pressure environment mainly because what? It's even because of their kind of structure, right? Like their tunica media.
The media. That's what it is. It's because they don't have the structure. It's just not as profound as the elastic.
Right. They have the tunica media that create one wall valves, right? And it's
Mhm.
really one way. Like that's the thing about these valves. They have to go towards the heart, and there's no backing. They're
Okay.
preventing back, like kind of this backflow that we were talking about last week, right? So just know that that's, the veins are kind of this way in their structure. And then, veins, like, they branch into venules, right? Um, and essentially, when you think about it, in terms of the capillaries you were talking about earlier, that is, this is where that happens, right? So you have the arteries that branches into the arterial, that branches into the capillaries. And then once all that exchange happen, it becomes deoxygenated and then it reaches the venules, right? And the venules' job is then to go back to the medium to large arteries in the veins to return that back to the heart, right? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So that's pretty much like everything for today. I know that you have to be somewhere. So tomorrow we'll meet again to talk about the lymph, and then we'll just kind of bring it home on everything.